Yes, indeedy, folks. It's the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. I was considering a piece on the rise of Bible worship. We talked a while back about bibliolatry, and there was actually, for a time, a movement called Bible worship. And I was looking into the history of that. I found a much more interesting history, however. Of course, the concept of Bible worship is dependent on the invention of one particular thing, and that is the printing press. Before the printing press, people didn't have books. They didn't read. There were very few people in the world who could read, and even fewer who could write. So reading was not a part of the concept of worshiping God. Probably your local parish priest might not even know how to read or write. The relationship with God was much more a immediate living with your family, living with the community, living with nature experience. It was not something you found in a book. It's possible the cathedral in the town 2 days' journey from here might have a copy of the canonized books of the Bible, but it probably didn't have much to do with your daily experience with God. So it wasn't until the invention of the printing press, of course, that it got to where Bibles were common. And they got to where more and more people were reading. And it was not unusual for many people to only be able to afford one book. And so it was very common for that one book to be the Bible. It got to where reading the Bible was, well, they didn't have TV, they didn't have radio. It's what you did in the evening. On those cold, long, dark evenings, you sat around and read the Bible. And it got to where thinking of the Bible as being the Word of God became more and more an issue. Along with that came what came to be known as Bible worship. It got to where we were no longer worshiping our existence with the living God. We were worshiping a book because it held the truth as opposed to the mundane, everyday creation. Well, that was an interesting phenomena, and there are still evidences of it today, many, I think. But what I found that was interesting was not just that story, but the story of the influence of the press. Johanna Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1439, which was, 500 years ago. And within 50 to 60 years, pretty well the entire classical canon had been put into the press, had been made available through books. By the classical canon, we not only mean the Bible, which Gutenberg did come up with some beautiful Bibles. Let's look at some examples there. Needless to say, if you can get your hands on one of these, you wouldn't have to worry about retiring. They, of course, are still in existence. I don't know how many, but they are lovely works. The first time that instead of Bibles being written on vellum, they were printed on paper. So while the Bible was being distributed, so were all of the rest of the canon. All of the works of Aristotle, all of the works of, all of the classical works that we'd been passing down for years and years and years, for thousands of years, were suddenly available to researchers all over Europe. and research they did. There were several things that came out of this, not the least of which is an awful lot of what we today call the scientific approach to things, the scientific principle of how you prove things true. One of the things that came from having words that were predictably repeated was that people started wanting rights to copyrights. Always before, if there were two copies of a book, neither one of them said the same thing. There would be translation differences because of the people copying them. But now, not only were the words the same, the way they were laid out on the page was the same. Everything was the same. The page number was the same. You could start referring to things in your letters to one another about page number so-and-so, paragraph number so-and-so. Well, suddenly it became very important who actually wrote these things. Before, well, it's the work of Aristotle, but it's been passed through so many. It's the work of John or Matthew, but it's been passed through so many pens. Who knows what John or Matthew ever said? But now, suddenly, what you said and what you put to paper could be reliably, predictably, and into the future reproduced. So suddenly, property rights, intellectual property rights, copyrights, and needing peer review, needing people to say, oh, this is John's work. We have looked at his work. We have compared it to Philip's work, and we can tell that Philip and John have done the same research and have proven the same point reliably in a scientific manner. So really, the Gutenberg press did two things. One, it made for a large number of people who got to where instead of worshiping a living God, began to worship a book. It also made for a large number of people who were approaching science in a new and very specific way. Very interesting. So let's take this two approaches of what are coming out of the Gutenberg Bible, out of the Gutenberg press, and come up to 1850. In 1850, there were two men working. One is a guy named John Nelson Darby. I don't know if you heard of him or not. He was a church leader. He came up with, he was one of the people who agreed with the concepts that the authority of God does not come from a central authority, but rather from the experiences of each individual person. And he was quite an influential guy. About 1850, he came up with a theory called the sacred rapture, or the secret rapture, rather, which was that Christ was going to remove his bride, meaning the church, and Darby figured everybody in it, I think, before the catastrophe of the end of the world. Before that, nobody had ever read the Bible to mean that there would be a rapture, that all the good people will go floating in the sky and be able to watch all the bad people go through tribulation. That is a brand new religion, folks. And it came out of Bible worship, which is a brand new religion, all made possible by the printing press. Great fun. Now, in 1850, there was another guy working, and his name you may have heard. That was Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was reading those books that scientists were putting out rather than religious people were putting out. And he, of course, came up with the theory of evolution. Well, the Darbyists, the fundamentalists, not all Christians, mind you. I'm not talking about Christians here. I'm talking about fundamentalists. The people who worship the Bible as the inerrant Word of God. The Darbyists have been following their path since 1850. And of course, the Darwinists have been following their path. And we've had some amusing times out of that now, haven't we? 150 years, 160 years now. One interesting thing about these two men, Darby was born in 1800 and died in 1882. Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and died in 1882. In fact, Charles Darwin died on the 19th of April in 1882, and Darby died on the 29th of April, exactly 10 days later in the same year. An interesting coincidence. So that was my discovery as I went out to look at how the human approach to religion and the human approach to science have evolved. And what an interesting change this one little invention made, called the printing press. Let's drive Moab. In the spring of 2007, I went exploring Moab. On past adventures, we have gone exploring Highway 6 and the trains that run along it. And when we first got to Moab, we went down Highway 279 along the river, a very beautiful drive. The next day, we went out Highway 313, headed toward Canyonlands, and stopped by Dead Horse Point, a Utah state park. Before we went exploring the Canyonlands National Park, we stopped and looked at the little road that goes from the end of 279 up to where the Canyonlands National Park is, a place called Schaefer Road, a very dramatic little dirt road. Last week, we drove through the very narrow little neck that takes you out onto what they call Gray's pasture, and then out onto the long island in the sky that runs between Green River and the Colorado River. When we got to the junction out on Island in the Sky last week, we headed south and went out to Grandview Point, looking over where the Colorado and Green Rivers come together. Today we're headed on the road that goes to the north of Island in the Sky up to an amazing place called Upheaval Dome. After a day in the car, it was kind of a treat to realize we have to go for quite a little bit of a hike in order to make it to Upheaval Dome. I will admit to a few longing glances back at the parking lot and the road that I came in on, kind of wondering if I really wanted to take as long a hike as this was going to be. But once I got to the top of this little knoll, I found that the hike had been worth it, and indeed, I ended up taking a little bit of an extended walk in order to get better views. This structure is over 2 miles wide. Scientists continue to debate exactly how Upheaval Dome ended up being in this relatively flat country. Everything's flat and level and layered until you get here where it's all domed up. One theory is that it's the area of a meteor impact which imploded on itself and then has been washed away, leaving only the dome. Another theory understands that there's a lot of salt under all of this. Under the pressures of all the sediment that's sitting on top of the salt is a liquid magma sort of affair, and this is where it's been pushing up, pushing a dome up, and then the dome wore away to the features that we see. Other theories are that lava was rising up under this and formed this deformation in the land, and that it is the remnants of a volcanic explosion. Here is a little glimpse of the road coming toward Upheaval Dome. Here we're heading back to the parking lot. And a little glimpse of what we just went trekking over. Just before you get to Upheaval Dome, there is a feature called Whale Rock. And it just looks like a big old whale laying out there in the middle of the desert. From Upheaval Dome, we drive over to Mesa Arch and once again take a little walk to go find one of the great features of Canyonlands National Park. walk out to Mesa Arch. Really is a lovely little trail. Lots of interesting little cairns like this to enjoy, and fairly easy trek. Mesa Arch itself is an interesting feature in that it is right up against the canyon. The canyon has slid away from it, and it is still suspended between two abutments on the canyon wall. It is not a freestanding arch like you see out in Arches National Park. Here we are right up next to it, looking down through the hole between it and the canyon wall. And we are back on the path leading us through this amazing country. You know your beer drinking guide loves to see signs like this when he's out driving around in the countryside. And on this little road, we drive back across Gray's pasture to the neck and to the mainland and away from Canyonlands National Park. I learned about somebody new this week. His name is Larry LaPrise. Larry LaPrise was born in 1912 in Detroit, Michigan, And he was playing in a band called the Ram Trio in Sun Valley during the 1940s. It was during this time that he came up with a song for the people that were hanging out at Sun Valley to dance to after they had been skiing all day or playing golf. Ever since then, philosophers and religious people have been having to argue about what if the Hokey Pokey really is what it's all about. Yes, indeed, Larry LaPrise wrote the Hokey Pokey at Sun Valley. First, it was written in the 40s. It was first recorded in 49. He received the U.S. copyright to it in 1950. He was sued by a English/Scotsman who said that he had written the original Hokey Pokey in Europe during the Second World War, and they settled out of court, so we don't really know exactly what was going on with that. But we do know that the Hokey Pokey has gone on to be something that we all know. In light of that, it was interesting the unfortunate incident that happened during Larry's funeral in Gooding. He had been a good man and people had always really enjoyed him. So it was really unfortunate that during his funeral ritual, they were preparing him for burial. As they put him into his coffin, they put his left leg in, and that's when all the trouble started. And that's another episode of the Beer Drinker's Guide to the Great Wahoo. Thanks for joining me. Welcome back next week when we'll go up a very bizarre little twisty road and have a great dinner overlooking Moab. And who knows what else your beer drinking guide will find to babble about. In the meantime, keep celebrating the Great Wahoo!